4.3 Soil formation and erosion. So, properties of soil are determined by these 5 things: parent material, climate, topography, organisms, and time. Parent material. Obviously, the rock that forms the inorganic component of soil is going to have an effect on the properties of your soil. If you have quartz, it's nutrient poor. If you have calcium carbonate, it has a lot of calcium, it has a high pH. It's great for growing crops. Calcium is one of those excellent inorganic resources that plants need. So, yeah, the inorganic component of the rocks that form up the dirt part of your soil, absolutely important. The climate, depending on your climate, that affects your soil formation. If it is too cold, like in the tundra, you're going to have a lot of undecomposed organic material. It is too cold for those decomposers to do their job. Where it's very humid, you're going to have very rapid decomposition. So your nutrients are going to cycle into new plants quickly. They're not going to have time to make it into soils. They're not going to leach in. Instead, they're going to be taken up by other plants very quickly. Topography. This is the way that land is laid out. So, slope and arrangement of landscape. Here, where you have very steep slopes, you're not going to have very nice soils, because gravity's not going to let those soils get there and then stay there. Down in valleys, in these low points, where water is going to naturally flow because of gravity, that's where you're going to have your nice, thick soil horizons. That's where you're going to have the good organic stuff. It also affects the amount of erosion. When you have these high points, they're more influenced by water and wind, so they're going to erode faster, but they're also going to weather faster. The organisms that are present. Plants remove nutrients and they excrete acids. Animals, tunneling ones, other ones that burrow, they're going to dig through the soil. They're going to increase porosity so you can have more oxygen or water mixed in with your soils. All of the organisms are contributing to nutrient cycling. Most of the organisms found in soil are those microscopic detritivores and decomposers, and humans absolutely have an impact on soil. And then time. The older the soil, the more organic material has had time to accumulate, and you end up with those very distinct horizons. Anthropogenic soil degradation. Anthropogenic, caused by humans, degradation, lowering in quality. This is a pretty simple picture, but you have a lot going on here. You have this soil being plowed, it's being raked up. What's happening is these root systems are being destroyed. Root systems are very powerful tools for holding soil in place, helping prevent that erosion. When these root systems are destroyed, your soils are now much more exposed and they will weather more likely. In addition to the root systems being destroyed, they're now exposed to wind and sunlight, so their water in them is going to evaporate faster. That's also going to help them erode faster. Dry soil erodes a lot faster than wet soil. That's why you have dust and not flying sludge. All the animals that were living in this topsoil have now been displaced or killed. Some of them can't tolerate the heat from the sun, so they're going to die. Some of them require lots of water to live. When that soil dries out, they're not going to be able to live anymore. So, simple picture, but there's a lot going on here. Okay, compaction of soil. This is a big one. This is where humans are squeezing out all of those pore spaces in soil. Here you can see these tractor tire marks, and they've squished that soil in a good inch or two. Now, when you do this over and over again, you're going to squeeze those top 2 inches or so completely free of space. They're going to look more like this than they will like this. You're not going to have a lot of pore space in there. It's going to be filled up. That pore space is important because soil is an ecosystem. The organisms in there need oxygen. They need water. When you squeeze it all out, they can't get more oxygen. They can't get more water. It forms almost this artificial impermeable surface in nature. Some of the effects, you end up with drying. Water won't circulate, so your soil gets very dry. You can't replenish the water that's in it. Kind of going along with that is waterlogging. You're going to have too much water sitting at the surface, and since oxygen needs to be carried down into soil by being dissolved in water, those critters aren't going to get new supplies of oxygen. And then mechanically, compacted soil is much more difficult for roots to grow through, so it's harder for your plants to keep planting. Okay. The loss of vegetation is a positive feedback loop. You lose vegetation, which makes it harder to retain soil. You're going to have more erosion, you're going to lose nutrients in that soil, which means you will lose more vegetation. That loss of more vegetation leads to more erosion and nutrient loss, which leads back to more vegetation dying off. There's no return to normality, so it's a positive feedback loop. Okay. Traditional agriculture is another way that humans are degrading soil. By growing the same crops in the same area, those minerals that are needed to grow are used up in soil. With agriculture, farmers are growing stuff and then they're selling it and shipping it off somewhere else, so those nutrients are being removed. You can offset that slightly with fertilizers, but you're just playing a delaying game. Here we have a table of the approximate decrease in these minerals in fruits and vegetables since 1940. Pretty significant. And then over here we have the same sort of graph, same sort of information but presented as a graph. You can see that rapid decline from the early 1900s until the mid-70s. This was because agriculture became more mechanized. Farmers could farm more and bigger. And then we had the Green Revolution after that, where farming could happen even more intensely. And then finally we have the use of pesticides. Pesticides are a chemical pollution. They're designed to kill things that are eating your plants. That has an impact on soil because most of these pesticides are just being sprayed indiscriminately. They're not being applied to just the plants. So this is going to inevitably end up in the water and then in the soil. Soil degradation. Here we have a map of the relative degradation of soil. Where it's most degraded are where you have these high population centers or areas that have been traditionally heavily used for agriculture. This is going to be an issue because these farming practices are going to have to be amended. And if you look here, where population growth is expected to be highest in the coming generations, we have India, China, and sub-Saharan Africa. Their soils are already in rough shape. The American Midwest, kind of the breadbasket of the country, has degraded soils. That's going to be an issue. All right, properties of soil. Size and weight. This is a physical property. The soil sediment is organized by size. The largest pieces are sand, the middlest pieces are silt, the smallest pieces are clay. Soil is made of different combinations of sand, silt, and clay. Permeability. This is another physical property. This is how easily substances can flow through your soils. Sand has a higher permeability than silt, which has a higher permeability than clay. That is a function of the size. If you have large particles, if you try to smush them together, you have larger gaps between the pieces. It's easier for water to flow through because these gaps are bigger. Clay, on the other hand, has a much lower surface area, so the particles can fit much more tightly together, so it's a lot harder for water to flow through. All right, then we have porosity. This is the percent empty space in the soil. Now, this is less a function of particle size and more a function of the uniformity of a sample. If you have particles where all the sizes are the same, they're uniform, you're going to have higher porosity than if you have a soil sample where your sizes are mixed. Here we have some examples over here. We have low porosity and low permeability because you have different sizes and shapes. Clay, we have a lot of space between these sediment, but low permeability because each of the different sediments are kind of covering access to those next pores. To flow through, water needs a connected path. Okay, landfills. Many landfills are lined with clay for the physical properties of clay. It has very low permeability, which means that leachate, that wastewater from the landfill is not going to leak through and contaminate your groundwater in the surrounding area. It's one less thing to worry about. Now, landfills usually have multiple little defenses against this leaking. The two most common are these layers of clay and then plastic sheeting. There's also these leachate collection systems that will collect as much of the wastewater as possible. And then when you're done, you cover the whole thing with dirt and you put a methane release and collection system in there so it doesn't blow up. This is a landfill in Mexico showing that process. We can't see the clay, but underneath this plastic is a layer of clay. Then there's plastic, and then there's a series of tires. That's to keep anything sharp in this trash from puncturing the plastic or potentially cracking the clay. Then you take your trash, cover it with dirt, move on to the next section. Okay. You don't want to put landfills where you have sandy soils, because if that leachate escapes, you're going to end up with contaminated groundwater very quickly, and it's going to spread. It's going to be very difficult to clean up afterwards. Okay, so here we just have the different techniques you would use to water different types of soil. Clay holds onto a lot of water. It absorbs and releases water slowly. So you need to apply water very slowly. Sand is very porous because of the large particle size. So if you try to water it, it's going to absorb water very quickly. It's also going to release that water very quickly. It's going to evaporate quickly. Then we have this idea of loam. Loam is a term to describe a mixture of sands, silts, and clays. And we'll see more about that in a moment. Okay, chemical properties of soil. We have CEC, cation exchange capacity. It's the electrical charge of your soil. Water is very soluble. Water is a great solvent because of the polarity of its covalent bonds. So if water's polarity, its ability to dissolve nutrients, is stronger than the surrounding soils, those nutrients are going to leach out of your soil. They're going to move wherever the water is moving. So soils with a high cation exchange capacity, are going to be able to hold on to those nutrients. And clays and organic matters have your highest CECs. Then we had a video. And then here we have a data table. Our soil types that are highest in clay have the highest CECs, and our organic matter has a much higher CEC than any type of clay. And then base saturation. This is the proportion of acids to bases in your soil. Ideally, you want it to be more alkaline, because those alkaline pHs are better at absorbing a lot of these inorganic minerals. Okay. Loam, mixtures of sand, silts, and clays. We have different particle sizes. You mix them all together, you get loam. Loam maximizes the good parts of the different soils, the good properties, and it minimizes the negatives. So very rarely do you want pure samples of soils. You want those mixtures, those loams. In the San Francisco Bay Area, it's floodplain soil, so it has a lot of nutrient-holding clays, but it also has a high proportion of sand and silt, so there's not there you have nice balance between water and nutrient retention and release of water. It's a nice fertile loam. And then as a side note, it's a nice dark color. Darker soils tend to be higher in organic matter, so you have a lot more of those organic nutrients, you have a lot more biological activity. Those tend to be your healthier soils. If your soil is a very washed out whitish gray color, you might have a lot of mineral, but you don't have a lot of organic matter. Okay, finally, your biological properties of soil. It's the living stuff in there. We have fungi, bacteria, and protozoans. They make up most of the organisms. They're responsible for decomposition. Then you have your detritivores, rodents, earthworms, snails, slugs. They're physically breaking down that larger waste so the decomposers can do their job. And then you have these free-living nitrogen-fixing bacteria. Most nitrogen-fixing bacteria are found in plant root systems, But you also have these free-living ones that are just loose in soil doing their thing. They contribute to the nitrogen cycle, obviously. Then we have a soil food web. It functions the exact same way as a regular food web, but now we have it's being specific to a soil-based ecosystem, but it follows the same patterns. You have your sun, your producers, your primary consumers, your secondary consumers, your tertiary consumers, etc. Also, we have nematodes, the most common organism on Earth. Soil texture charts. We have a separate video about how to read these, so make sure you check that out. This is a concept that I could almost guarantee College Board will ask you about.